Hello to everyone. I am Pascal Bouton, member of the FISA Competitive Commission, and today I have the pleasure to introduce two speakers. The first one is Laurent Schmitt from France. Laurent is Doctor of Biology and Associate Researcher at the University of Lausanne. He is Director of the High-Level Research and Expertise Department at the National Nordic Ski Center of Prémanon in France. Laurent was a professor of physical and sports education and a national cross-country ski coach for the French men's teams between 1986 and 1999. He has been intervening at INSEP, National Institute of Sport, in the continuous training of national coaches from all Olympic sports federations since 2006, and giving advice to coaches and athletes from many disciplines: athletics, triathlon, biathlon, rowing, canoeing, cycling, tennis, athletics. He is currently working on optimizing hypoxia training methods, individualization and training adaptation methods, analysis of fatigue and stress, and adaptation of remedial measures to recover from states of fatigue and stress. His research and development work focus on the physical effects of training intensities. This will be the subject of his presentation today. The second speaker is Jurgen Steineke from Germany. Jurgen Steineke is professor of sports and rehabilitation medicine and professor at the University of Ulm Medical Center in Germany. As a sports physician and cardiologist, he is also involved in anti-doping and sports medicine for Olympic sports, especially rowing. He works in particular on the physiology of performance for competitive athletes, professional and national teams, with research focused on the diagnosis of sports-specific performance in rowing and fencing, sports cardiology, and overtraining and overload syndromes. Jurgen was a rower, then a manager, before becoming the doctor of the German rowing team in 1989. In 2000, he became a member of the FISA Sports Medicine Commission, of which he has been in charge since 2016. The purpose of this commission is to oversee and advise on all medical and anti-doping aspects of rowing. Today, given the global health conditions related to COVID-19, it is important to have information and recommendations for sports training. So, I have the pleasure to introduce Jurgen Steineker, who will present the different aspects of training in COVID times. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for your invitation. I am Laurent Schmitt, head physiologist at the French National Nordic Ski Center of Prémanon. The aim of my presentation is to show how the training intensity are distributed in world-class athletes in endurance disciplines, and to show some scientific publications that support this, and after to propose some ways and hypotheses to explain and justify this distribution. There are still some beliefs to discuss in the world of sport coaching, like, for example, no pain, no gain. Training must be tiring to be effective. the more you train at high intensity, the better. To improve your VO2 max level, you have to train at VO2 max. And to improve the power at the threshold of lactate accumulation, you have to train at the intensity of this threshold. Classically, the training distribution are separated by lactate threshold 1 and lactate threshold 2, or ventilatory threshold 1, ventilatory threshold 2. And the sensation in this different zone of training separate a low intensity of training with slight shortness of breath. We are able to have inspiration through the nose and able to speak. Medium intensity of training with a constant shortness of breath, inspiration through the nose and the mouth, and it's become difficult to speak. And the high intensity of training with a situation of hyperventilation, inspiration only through the mouth, and it's impossible, unable to speak. In Norway, in discipline sports, the Norwegian team and coaches use this 5 zone of intensity of training, with one the low intensity training characterized by in heart rate by an intensity around 6 to 75% of heart rate max. And in France, we use a model similar, and for example, for we use this test to determine sometimes during the 1 year, 2 or 3 times the aerobic capacity of the athlete.
Sur ces 3 jours, nous allons tester sur notre nouveau tapis les niveaux de VO2 max et puis d'endurance des athlètes. On va déterminer leur seuil anaérobie pour déterminer leurs intensités d'entraînement, et ces tests vont nous servir en fait un petit peu à faire la carte d'identité des athlètes en trouvant leur qualité, leurs points forts, leurs points faibles, et on va pouvoir comparer comme ça leur évolution d'un test à l'autre.
Les athlètes, on prend comment?
Tu viens ici, tu mets ta main droite là, tu poses ta main gauche ici.
Et donc, j'arrête mes gants.
Ouais.
This test permits to determine 5 zones of training, with in green the low intensity of training under the first lactate threshold, yellow between the 2 threshold, then just at the intensity 3 at the second ventilatory threshold, after in red above the second intensity threshold with interval training session and races, and in intensity 5, the zone for the speed and strength training session. We calculate the training load by multiply the training duration of a session by a coefficient of intensity. Around 12 years ago, we used this system of training with a large amount of training between the threshold 1 and threshold 2. But from around 20 years, we use the system called polarized system with a lot of training session in the intensity under latex threshold 1, named the low intensity training. Very few of training between the two thresholds and some session in the zone of in-interval training. Now I illustrate the following slide by some example of distribution of training in world-class athletes. And to begin with Igor Christiansen in marathon, we use in different period, in preparation period and in competition, a lot of low intensity training in green, light green. It's surprising for a runner because very often the runner use the intensity between the two thresholds, but she was five-time world record with a very good results in marathon. Bente Skari, four-time world champion, a lot of victory in World Cup. It's interesting to analyze all the evolution of the training in volume with the level of VO2 max from 18 years old until 31, and to observe that the best level of VO2 max was obtained with a large part of the very low intensity of training. In France, with Vincent Vitoz, cross-country skiers world champion, the same, near 90% of low intensity of training, because we have to add the light green, the green, and the blue. It's a different type of training, but all at low intensity of training. Same observation with in biathlon Saint-Brieuc, a lot of aerobic session. It's here the number of sessions by week, not the volume, and we know distribution between strength training, low intensity aerobic training, and after interval training, and after here we have the races. The same for Florence Bavrel, gold medal in Olympic Games in Turin. Is actually the same analysis in volume with strength, low intensity training, and here the training at the second ventilatory threshold, a short quantity of interval, and the races. Zapico in an elite male road cyclist in a longitudinal study show this one. The training in winter mesocycle with a lot of low intensity training, medium intensity training, fuse volume of in hour, a few volume of high intensity of training with an increase in VO2 max and power at second ventilatory threshold and at third ventilatory threshold. The result of this training was good. And when the volume increased, and particularly the medium intensity training and the high intensity training, we observe a light decrease in VO2 max and light decrease in power at second ventilatory threshold and at the first ventilatory threshold. It's interesting to observe that for an elite athlete, when you improve the volume and particularly this part of training, the result, the performance in the aerobic parameter decrease, not continue to improve. Marit Jurgen was during more than 10 years the best cross-country skiers in the world. and the analysis of the training show in different periods the same distribution of the training with a large predominance of low intensity training. We are here the speed, strength, interval, medium intensity training, and high intensity training. This slide shows an important observation. It's the week with a lot of volume or the lot of in percentage the lot of low intensity training with near 90% of the total volume. This distribution of training correspond to the best result in World Cup with the maximum of first place. I analyze the training of Martin Foucault because he worked a lot in the National Center. And we observe also the same evolution in 11 years with between 85 to 90% of low intensity of training, but not the last season with a difference of distribution. We have two observations to do in this plan. This one is a diminution of the volume because he was sick. He has a mononucleose situation, and here we observe also a modification in the distribution with a decrease in low intensity of training and increase in medium intensity of training. This is not, it's observed also with here the quantity of podium during each season. And when for the years with the mononucleus, the result was decreased, but it was more decreased with this modification of the intensity of training, with the decrease in low intensity of training and increase in medium intensity, and a lot with the strength training session. Mononucleus here, and this one with a modification of the distribution with a lower result in podium. After I did the correlation between the World Cup podium and the total training and low intensity volume performed during the season, and we can notice this relationship between the quantity of podium and the volume of training. More we train, more he had a high quantity of podium, and particularly a strong correlation between the volume of low intensity and training and the quantity of podium realized. Now I propose to analyze some study who validate the predominance of low intensity in our sport with a control group. And to begin with the study of Esteve Lanao, which present a work with 12 high-level runners divided in two groups, 6 in each. And pretest we have a 10-kilometer running maximum performance, and after 18 weeks of training, the post-test. The training was defined between the two groups. Group 1 with near 80% of low intensity of training, 12% with medium intensity of training, and the group 2, reduction in low intensity of training until around 68% of the total volume, and in medium intensity training around 23-24% of the total. And the result, interestingly, shows this a good and show an increase in performance in the two groups, but a significant difference between the group with the best evolution in the group with low predominance, big predominance as low intensity of training. So to train a little more to increase the intensity and with more medium training intensity produce less result in maximal performance than to train with 80% of low intensity of training. Ingham with rowers show a comparison between a training with only low intensity of training compared to a training with a mixed of 70% of low intensity with 30% of high intensity of training. The difference is mainly shown in the power at the first and second lactate threshold, with very big difference, 10 and 14% with a low intensity and only 2 and 5 when we mix low and high intensity of training. Another study, which crossover study, very interesting, with Neil, with trained cyclists. First, during 4 weeks, perform a detraining period, a controlled detraining period, to stabilize for all the groups the training. And after, the group was divided in two parts, one with a polarized distribution and other a threshold training. And they trained during 6 weeks, and after they had also again a detraining period of 4 weeks. And after, the polarized groups became threshold groups, and the threshold group became polarized groups. So after, we have to compare the polarized group with the threshold groups, and we observe in the threshold group training total training time significantly higher than the polarized, and also for the training load. And in a polarized group, distribution with 80% of low intensity with 20% of high intensity. And in the threshold group, 57 in low intensity of training and 43% in threshold in medium intensity groups, medium intensity. The results show only significant evolution in the polarized groups, here in the threshold and here in the maximal power. And after, during the 40 kilometers maximal test, the change were similar in the two groups. And interestingly, the time to fatigue, 95% of maximal power, increased significantly more in the polarized group than in the threshold group. So this indicates that the endurance is more improved in this group, polarized, than in the other one. Also, the lactate transport, MCT4, was a little more graphically, but not so significant, graphically more increase in the polarized group than in the threshold group. Another question can be proposed, because we see that in endurance it's important to have a low predominance of low intensity in the endurance session, training session, but we also have this question for the aerobic interval training. Is it more interesting to train with a short interval but high intensity interval training, or to use long interval training with lower intensity. One response can be proposed by Sandbach with the national junior team in Norway in cross-country skiers, and he proposed a control group with 2 additional low-intensity sessions by week, more than the habitual training, and after a short interval group with 2 interval training sessions by week, with 94% of heart rate max of so high intensity, with 2 to 4 minutes of work and 50 to 20 minutes of total work. And third group, long interval group, with 2 interval training sessions by week at an intensity of 91% of heart rate max, with 5 to 10 minutes for exercise, high-level exercise, and 40 to 45 minutes of total work. And the result showed that the group long interval training improve significantly the VO2 at second ventilatory threshold, not the other group. In VO2 max, it's the same improvement in the 2 interval group, no change in the control group. But in the maximal test with a 7-kilometer hill run test, only the group with a long interval at lower intensity improve. In a percentage you have here, for example, here the improvement is around 5%, and in the 12 roller ski test performance, around 7% of improvement in this maximal test, with no very light improvement in the 2 other group. So, like for the endurance, it appears more interesting to use a long interval, but at a lower intensity, exactly, for example, between the intensity at second ventilatory threshold and the intensity of VO2 max. Now, I propose to some physiological explanation, some ways to explain, sometimes with the improvement of free acid utilization and to decrease the lactate production, the effect of heart rate variability changes during the training, the change also in the systolic volume of the heart, and the quantity of mitochondria in the muscular cells. This not published data was conducted with the 5 best French biathletes in a running test with steps of 5 minutes in an incremental test to determine the first lactate and the second lactate. The training of 3 months between June and September was 196 hours with 90% of the total volume. So a great predominance of low intensity of training. We observe between June and September a decrease of the lactate production at each step of intensity, with absolutely no improvement in VO2 max. In VO2, sorry, not VO2 max, in VO2 at each step. And also, one interesting thing is the level of first lactate threshold and second lactate threshold. That, for example, for an athlete like Martin Fourcade, is for the first lactate threshold around 1.2 millimole of lactate, and the second around 2 millimole of lactate. So absolutely not 2 and 4, but clearly lower than this level. Now, the importance of heart rate variability to explain the positive effect of low intensity of training. We have here the improvement year per year of the volume, low intensity training, total volume, the quantity of podium, and here the representation, the parameter, high frequency in the spectral energy analysis divided by heart rate, and the evolution, so the mean for the season of the test realized, and we observed a change approach of the improvement in volume and quantity of podium of training. When I did the correlation, I found a clear relation between the parasympathetic parameters like high frequency spectral analysis, RMSSD in temporal analysis, heart rate, and when the improvement in podium, we observed an improvement in parameters of activity of the parasympathetic system. So it's correlated. When you increase by the training the parasympathetic system for Martin Fourcade, he increased also the quantity of podium. This correlation shows the relationship between the total volume of training and the high frequency represents the parasympathetic activity and the heart rate. And we show also a big significant correlation when the volume is very high with a very high level of, we observe a very high level of parasympathetic activity, or the events, this inverse. And we know that here that low intensity of training has an effect of parasympathetic activity. The low intensity of training increase the energy in the parasympathetic system, and we show that in this graph with the improvement here in hours in low intensity, and here the improvement is high frequency and heart rate. Another study with our national team was Nordic combined and cross-country skiing. We have a 10 kilometers roller ski test, maximal test before and after, and a design of the training, and each day heart rate variability. The comparison of the training showed that in cross-country skiers, more important volume performed, and training load also more important in the group of cross-country skiers. And it's interesting to observe the difference of the distribution, with in Nordic combined 51.2% of low intensity of training, and a big here on high percent of strength training with 39.4% with strength training session, and in cross-country skiers 81.6% with low intensity of training, and in the strength training session 12.9. The result in the 10-kilometer roller ski test showed a decrease of performance in Nordic combined, decrease mean of 4% of degradation of the performance, and in cross-country skier an increase in performance around 3 in the group, with a very homogeneous improvement of the performance. Associated with distribution of the training and the results, we observed in the cross-country skier group in blue, and improvement in all the parameters of heart rate variability. We have here the heart rate in supine, heart rate in standing, HF, the main parameters in supine position here, low frequency here, total, and in standing, HF, the low frequency in standing, the main parameter in standing position, and the total power. All these parameters were increased in the cross-country skier group, and in Nordic combined, only the high frequency in supine decreased significantly. But when we analyze the typology of fatigue, we show, as I said, in cross-country skiers, the improvement in all parameters. But for one athlete in a Nordic ski group, a situation of orthosympathetic hypertonia with increase in low frequency in supine and increase in heart rate in supine. For 5 athletes, an hypotonia in parasympathetic orthosympathetic system with a decrease in all parameters, supine and standing, increase heart rate, supine and standing. For 1 athlete, no problem in supine, but on in standing, a decrease in low frequency and increase in heart rate. And for 1 athlete, an hypotonia in the parasympathetic system. So, for Rusco, for example, we can see this response. The endurance training at intensity of low intensity of training decrease orthosympathetic activation and catecholamine secretion, increase parasympathetic activation, which increase blood volume and venous return to the heart. So the systolic volume and the cardiac outflow increase. That corresponds of the effect effectively of the low intensity of training on the heart. And Astran and Rodal showed also in 1980 that at a percent of heart rate of 70 to 75, we have the maximum of systolic volume in the heart, and beyond this, with more intensity, the volume of systolic ejection not increase. We can show this in this picture with here 60% of maximal oxygen uptake, the level of VO2 max, 60%. We observe in the systolic ejection a stabilization after this level. That corresponds to in heart rate between 140 and 160. That corresponds to the around the intensity of the low intensity training. So it's resumed here, and after this may partly explain why low intensity training can increase the systolic volume, thus the maximal cardiac output, as well the level of VO2 max by increasing the systolic volume. When we analyze the effect of low intensity of training, medium intensity training and high intensity training in the different steps of the oxygen cascade, we observe with low intensity of training a big effect in the stroke volume, medium effect in vascularization, and big effect in muscular cells, particularly with the quantity of mitochondria and the pool of aerobic enzymes. With medium intensity of training, medium effect of stroke volume, but big effect of in vascularization, and medium effect in the peripheral muscular and peripheral, for example, cells. With a high intensity of training, we have an effect in the level of hemoglobin and 2-3 diphosphoglycerate and a small effect in the myoglobin in the muscular cells. So we can see each intensity produce improvement, but at a different level and with a different peripheral situation, central situation and peripheral. So we can see the green of low intensity of training appears very important to improve the level of VO2 max. This systemic presentation from Larsen and Jenkins completed shows that low intensity of training has a very big effect on maximal heart systolic volume and decrease the heart rate during exercise. And in the central adaptation, the medium intensity training improve a lot blood and plasma volume, and also the blood flow in muscular during exercise, and that high intensity of training improve a lot the resistance to the heat and also the force of the contraction of the heart rate of the heart. Now, in peripheral adaptation, low intensity of training have a lot of effect with an improvement of beta oxidation and phosphorylation oxidative, the enzymatic pool of this function, improves the utilization of free fatty acids, so decrease the lactate production, and also increase the quantity of mitochondrions in the muscular cells, and increase the transform of fiber, fast switch fiber to medium. Also, the medium intensity of training improve the capillary density, the possibility to stock the glycogen, and the capacity to transport the proton with NAD and FAD. And the high intensity of training in the peripheral adaptation improve the muscular buffer power, the enzyme in sodium-potassium ATPase, and the enzyme in glycolyze and glycogenolyze, and also the enzyme and the level of myoglobin. This slide shows the physiological improvement in low intensity of training, which considered very important in the training, with near 90% of the annual training volume, as I said before. But one thing important, when if you train with a low level of glycogen in the beginning of the training session, and if the training session is long, you can use during the session the protein and produce ammonia, and it could be a problem during the session. So it is necessary to be very protective or with alimentation of the hydration of the glycogen during the training session. In medium intensity training, it's considered not very important in the training, and too many sessions in this area can fatigue the athlete. It's not the base of the training for in endurance disciplines, it's clear. At the second ventilatory threshold, it's important in the training to develop the transport of the proton, and also to work with supercompensation in glycogen. In high intensity zone, it's a very important training in zone, but with to use a long interval training session, not at very high intensity, but on intensity between intensity of the second threshold and the intensity at the VO2 max. But we have to note that this session can produce ammonia, so it's important to well organize the session during the week. And to train at very high intensity, it's not important in the endurance disciplines, because this section can be negative on VO2 max, decrease a lot the autonomic nervous system energy, and produce a lot of fatigue. To termine, I propose you to a systemic approach of the different physiological effects below the lactate threshold 1. When we train below the first lactate threshold, the total energy of the autonomic nervous system increase, because the parasympathetic energy increase with the stabilization of the sympathetic energy. We increase the stroke volume, a medium increase in blood and plasma volume in vascularization, but a great increase in quantity of mitochondrion, aerobic enzyme, and capacity of the free fatty acid utilization. When we train between the two thresholds, the total energy of neurovegetative system or autonomic nervous system decrease with the decrease in parasympathetic energy and an increase in sympathetic system. The stroke volume is stable, not high development in this intensity, but a great development in blood and plasma volume, in vascularization, in capacity to transport the H pulsion, proton, and to work to have a supercompensation of the glycogen in the muscle. When we train above the lactate threshold 2, we have a great decrease in total energy, in parasympathetic energy, great stimulation of the sympathetic system. The stroke volume is stable or decreased, but the heart tonicity increase. It's stable for blood and plasma volume, but we increase the buffer power, the enzyme of the glycolyze and glycogenolyze, the enzymatic system of phosphofructokinase and lactate dehydrogenase, and the myoglobin. And when we train in strength and speed training, it's interesting to observe the effect of the autonomic nervous system energy. And it's a very high stimulates the body, because we have a decrease in total energy, decrease in parasympathetic, and increase clear in sympathetic system, with no effect in the stroke volume or tonicity, blood and plasma volume, but an increase in the enzyme of creatine phosphate, in the enzyme of the glycolyze, and phosphofructokinase and lactate dehydrogenase. So strength and speed training can produce fatigue in the athlete. I thank you for your attention, and see you later for if you have any question. Thank you.
Hello together. My name is Jurgen Steineke. I am the chair of the Sports Medicine Commission of FISA, and I'm happy to present you something about COVID-19. COVID-19 is an issue which is really affecting us, and which is also creating a lot of problems. And this is the virus. And what is the virus doing with rowing? We know now the basic rules of Corona, wear a face mask, sanitize your hands, and keep distance. The disease is caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2, and the disease is called COVID-19. So these are the both terms which can be misunderstood. The problem of this virus is that it's easily transmitted by healthy appearing people. And that is the difference to many other infectious diseases. And there could be 2 days where people are infectious but have no or only minor symptoms. And this is the main problem. The typical symptoms are fever, cough, and disturbed smell and taste, and shortness of breath, diarrhea, and tiredness are symptoms which are often later in the course of the disease. The disease comes from a coronavirus, which has typical spikes on it, and that is the name of this coronavirus. We know about 10 coronaviruses, and this is the last advanced one. And these adhere to the human cell via the so-called ACE receptor to the cell and then invade the cell. They have been transmitted probably from bats or pangolins to man, and now they are transmitted by droplets, by aerosols, and by smear infections. And this is the way it is transmitted. Here's the infected subject, and it sneezes, droplets, and all the aerosols are around the subject, and then they invade the nasopharynx, where the primary infection takes place. And these bigger droplets can be easily withheld by a mask. Could be a surgical mask or a tooth mask. The smaller aerosols can only be effectively blocked by a more effective N95 or PP2 mask. And you see here is the site of infection, and you see here is the ACE2 receptor, which is mainly expressed in the nasopharynx. But there are also receptors downstream down in the bronchi and the alveoli. In the later part of the infection, the disease also invades the lungs, and then it starts to grow systematically. This is a challenge for our healthcare system. It's not for those people who have minor symptoms which recover easily, but approximately 10% of the subjects develop severe lower airway disease and pneumonia. This complication may arise later on, typically after the 10th day of infection. And from these patients, about 30% needs respiratory assistance, must be ventilated in the ICU care unit. And you see here from our hospital, a typical patient. This is a computer tomogram of the heart and the lung. And normally the lung looks like this, a lot of air. And the density here, this is all infection. And edema, you see here the edema also very well. And this lung looks not very nice. And this patient was 4 hours before he was feeling well, a little bit tired. And then after 6 hours later, he was at the ICU unit. And we don't forget that even young people die. Last week in my hospital, 4 people died, which are younger than 50 years old. And so it's not so often that young people die, but if they die, it's also a disaster. And it's also a problem how much capacity of the hospital is used. As long as the ICU is functioning well, that's no problem. But if there are too many patients, then even a good hospital gets under pressure, and this is not good. And this is a situation, only 10% are serious ill, but only 2.5% need ICU. That means for 1,000 with symptoms, 25 need a respirator therapy for 2 to 3 weeks. That means in our hospital, if you enter 20 people in our ICU, you have 20 beds blocked for 2 weeks, at least 2 weeks. We have 120 beds in my university hospital, but if you enter every week 20, then you have 60. And that means the capacity for other diseases, myocardial infarction, and other severe diseases is very largely diminished. You see here a curve which is from the presentation, April 2nd. You see here the first curve in Italy, and it looked a little bit nice then, and the first curves started, and we as FISA, Sports Medicine Commission, we made warning to the growing communities. But you see here first row of US infections. We have here 20,000 infections only per day, but it trends later on. And then there was a tendency flatten the curve. That's the Danish. They expected that the curve goes up, but they tried everything. That's also from the 2nd of April. They tried to not to have too much infections. And this is flatten the curve. But now we look at the Italian data 4 months later, and you see here, this was the first increase where we are totally afraid of. Now they have the second surge here. The second surge is now going down in Italy, but you see how many people are infected. That infection grow exponentially, and this is the problem. And we don't want to tell too much about US. You see Italy is here down, very small. You have here USA, you have here India, and you have here Brazil, and the Europeans are much lower, but this means we have waves in the infection. Yesterday, we had in the global aspect, we have 181,000 new cases as a single day in the whole world, and 12,080,000 are infected already. That is really a problem. The FISA guidelines have these tables in it, and you see here the WHO terminology of outbreaks. Typically, it starts with a local outbreak. It was in China. There's a low disease activity, and there's an animal to human transmission and small clusters. That means there are several groups which are infected. And then it spreads to more communities, to more clusters. That means more clusters, more people are involved. That's a spreading period. And then in this phase, we can then speak from a pandemic when it's spreading, when it's not locally contained. And the peak period is when its activity is high and there is no clear cluster transmission. The transmission is totally dispersed around, and that is the peak period, particularly in the extraordinary phases where you cannot really judge someone as healthy or not healthy. And then it goes down to the post-peak period, and then the post-pandemic period is then following, hopefully. We analyzed in the Sports Medicine Commission several times, where is the infection, where are the clusters? And there are a lot of studies, about 100 studies, and this is a meta-analysis just published. And it comes out from a lot of studies that the highest risk is at bars, at the household, at meals, elderly care, worker dormitories, food processing, work environment, and in religious ceremonies where people sing loudly in groups. And sport is also reported, but only in very defined circumstances and not in outdoor sports. We have no transmission until now in outdoor sports. I show you here a simulation of what is happening in closed rooms. And closed rooms is really the problem. We have here 10 people and one infected one. And we have no masks, 45 square meters, 4 hours together, 10 people, and you see 15% are probably infected. When the people wear masks, the rate goes down to 1%. And I have on others, I have this simulation online, and I like you to try this. You have here the same room, and you have now 50 square meters. When I increase the room size, the infectious rate, 50, it was 9 without masks. And if it's going to 100 square meters, the infectious rate goes down to 5% for 2 hours duration. When I decrease the duration, it goes down to 1 hour, it's 2%. Okay, so we look now for a longer time and we look at the effects here. We go to the 50 square meters room back. And then we increase the ceiling. If we have a high ceiling, the rate goes down, and the ceiling is much higher. It's going. The volume of the room is increased. We go down to the standard room again, 14%. We increase the ventilation. We open the window. It does a little bit, 2% less. Active ventilation, opens the door, the windows every hour to 10 minutes, decrease the rate significantly. If you have a ventilation system, you have only 2%. So we go back to no ventilation, and we look at the effect of loud speaking. And I have here the loud speaking. Loud speaking means like training. And you see here with high ventilation, you have a lot of infection in the room, and 90% of the people will get sick. But then we can increase ventilation, that with a good ventilation, you get down to 50%. That's much too much. We can decrease the exposure time, but we are at 21%. And then we use masks. With the closed mask, we get from 81% to 34%. A simple closed mask decreases the risk. Surgical mask to 14%, the FP2 mask, the very good mask, to below 0%. And that I invite you to use that link and to test for yourself what is the most convenient and safe environment. So we go further on. FISA and World Rowing has done a lot of discussions and working. We dealing with the problem risk assessment and the problem mitigation procedures. And we done about 12 publications where we are part of it, and we try to have the right measures for the right phase of the pandemic, the active, the contained outbreak, and the seasonal outbreak. And then we have also designed, you can read it in our webpage, what is the appropriate measures for rowing, for boathouse, and for weight room. It's quite clear in the pandemic phase, we have to restrict the use of community rooms. There is no public use of boathouses and so on. But we have to really protect ourselves. Single rowing will be not a problem in pandemic because you are single on the water. Crew rowing is only possible when the risk is lower. Therefore, we use that risk analysis for the rowing season 2020. And we had the chance with the organizers of the European Rowing Board from Duisburg, Belgrade, and Poznan to test our concepts and to try to make a safe environment for rowing. So objectives are clearly boat rowing has a low transmission risk. We want to avoid the transmission on land. We want to create a safe bubble for teams and staff. We want to control the health status of participant at the entrance. So to look is healthy or not, and limit the possibilities of transmission. We had in, and we are not a small sport. We have in, you see here the numbers of the accreditation, Poznan, Duisburg, Belgrade, and you see equipment people, visa people, media people, and OC people, which is significant, and team. You see in Poznan we had 1,000 athletes and 1,600 attendees without any spectators. So how we assessing the risk? We use the ILUM outcome assessment score in the publication, which I showed you. And you see here for Duisburg, there was a low overall risk because we were in the seasonal contained outbreak phase. And we go then to Belgrade. There was a higher risk because in Belgrade we had local clusters already, but we deem it sufficient. I will show you. And then we go into Poznan. In Poznan there was already a red zone, but we were aware of this. There was an active spreading, phase 5 according to WHO, but we decided to contain to conduct the World Champion as European Championships because our sport-related transmission risk, you see the graph, is very low. And then our tool gives us also the mitigation procedures, and you see here the outcome, and you see a curve understanding search capacity, public health awareness, and we have athlete-specific mitigation procedures and so on. That these, we all fulfilled our mitigation processes, and that was very important. The measures were hygienic conditions at the venue, at the hotels, separate teams from staff and to each others, limit social interactions, and also educate people. We did not do mandatory testing and relied on the self-certificate and the team doctor certificate. And we did in, like here, a lot of education. And we used also, I show you, we used also educationals to learn, that the people learn how to do this. Oops. And this was the result of this World Championships. Is now here we had approximately 2% and 4% in Belgrade demonstrated COVID symptoms after the event. 14 positive cases were reported in Poznan or after Poznan from 4 clusters. That means from 4 national teams. 8 positive cases in Belgrade, 1 cluster, and 2 single cases. There was no significant transmission between the teams at the event, and most likely the cases are imported with the teams. So we feel that the measures are appropriate, and we have a response from participants. 95% of the participants felt safe and well. But we have to reanalyze the data in the next weeks according to the pandemic. What's about the pandemic for athletes which have been ill? And you have here 2 examples. Ben O'Donnell, Ironman triathlon competitor, was on the ventilator for months and is now needs supplemental oxygen again, and he is not able to walk as fast as his young daughter. And here's a German Olympic champion in wrestling. Frank Stäbler is famous in Germany, decreased after the infection, and his performance is 20% down, which is incredible for an Olympic champion. And we have patients in my hospital, and particularly also in my ambulance, where people losing 50% of their aerobic capacity. People who were able to exercise with 500 watts have now 200 watts maximum capacity. I have patients which have only the ability to walk 2 stairs and have to stop this because of dyspnea. So this is a real danger of COVID, and it's really different from other diseases. And we have now detailed rules how to deal with such athletes. Clearly, if you have no problem and you recover after the virus infection, then you can, after 2 weeks of routine, you can come back to training. But there are athletes which have problems, and all people who are not recovering without symptoms should see the sports medicine doctor. I think to discuss the question of recovery after COVID is an own lecture. But there's, I think we should discuss that separately, but conclude this presentation. This is a clear hope that with all efforts in the world, we will contain the disease. And we as rowers are part of this effort. The vaccination gives us a chance. Until then, the virus will be a threat. This will be a threat also during the whole next year. We have, as an outdoor sport, a low inherited risk. We cannot really speculate what will be 21, but we can prepare. We need concepts we proved in 2020. We need the support by the rowing community, and we have to create trust in political decision makers, in our community, in the rowers, in the teams, and that is very important. The bubble concept is also recommended for athletes to train under the pandemic situation, and it's important for athletes to start again with training, to maintain their national team bubble, their club bubble in which they can train. That means the bubble concept means control your outside contacts, only healthy people allowed to the bubble, and then it's possible to train in a sustainable way and with infectious disease probability, which is very, very low. Use your mask, use your social distancing, use your disinfection measures. Affected athletes will need medical advice, but that will be another lecture. Thank you very much. And this is Olympic organizations who contributed to the item tool. And I have to thank all the people which contributed to this very tough season. I have particularly to say thank to the whole world drawing staff, the people who really made this happen, writing all this, and particularly not to name anyone in the staff, but and I have to also to thank to the Events Commission, to the all other FISA people who contributed to that. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Competitive Commission, I would like to thank Laurent and Jurgen for their contributions to the World Drawing 2020 Virtual Coaches Conference. I would like to remind you all that today's speakers will also take part in a live question and answer session on Saturday, 5th of December. The session for today's presentation will start at 17:40 CIT. Please send in your questions to Peter Coxon or put them in the Zoom chat at the time of the live session, and we will try to get as many answered as possible. Thank you to all of you for joining the conference. Bye.